Final Destination Bloodlines is out, and it provides some long-awaited answers, so now is the perfect time to look back across the 6 movies, the 9 novels, and the 2 comics to see if we can finally piece together the nature of the threat in this franchise. We all know it's described as death itself, but what exactly is this ominous presence, and how does it work? In this video, I'm going to take you through what I think are the best 5 theories in light of all the evidence. Make sure you stay to the last one because that takes my vote as the most interesting. It almost goes without saying that there will be massive spoilers ahead, so buckle up and let's kick things off. At number 5, death is a cosmic force. This is how most people tend to talk about the franchise. Essentially, this interpretation treats the entity of death as something that's baked into the universe, woven into the laws of physics. It might not even be a conscious entity. Here's Ian McKinley from Final Destination 3 to explain.
Newton says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So, that means that if death has taken action, so can we. And that action we take might have an opposite reaction that thwarts death's intent.
Now, he's joking around with this monologue. He doesn't yet believe what he's saying, but it's a helpful way of framing the theory. And the question that's raised in every movie is, how do you beat death's design? What is the opposite reaction that thwarts death's intent?
There are only 2 ways, by killing or by dying. If you take a life, you get the time that person had left.
What? No, I'm not gonna kill someone.
Maybe we should let the guy finish.
Then to truly break the cycle, you have to die.
And therefore, I wonder if the word force, even though it's used in the movies, is actually slightly misleading in terms of how death functions. Because as far as we can tell, there is no equal and opposite reaction. You can either die yourself or become a murderer. In both cases, death prevails. So if you really want to put a science word to it, death in these movies isn't a force, it's more like entropy, disorder. It can only increase. It's unstoppable. Of course, in Final Destination 2, Kimberly does manage to cheat death by being medically dead for a moment and then coming back. Your insightful comments on my previous video pointed out that there was a plan to kill her and Officer Burke on the train at the end of Final Destination 3, but that didn't happen due to the availability of the actors. I always love it when scheduling issues end up shaping the lore of a franchise, because all these years later, Bloodlines confirms that Kimberly did indeed manage to slip through death's grasp, and may still be alive. But attempts to emulate her strategy of cheating death are risky, as Eric and Bobby discover. William Bloodworth warns them, if you F with death, things get messy. Final Destination Bloodlines really presses into the ripple effect of interfering with death's design, and that's the main way it kind of expands the Final Destination lore, because Iris acts on her premonition in the 1960s to prevent the Skyview explosion, saving dozens of lives, and as a result all of those survivors are on death's list, and not only them, but their descendants too. Actually, you can imagine all sorts of people who would end up on death's list as a result of Iris saving the Skyview. For example, imagine that one of the Skyview survivors was a doctor. If he survived, he went on to save lots of other people in hospitals who would otherwise have died, and that puts more people on death's list, including perhaps the protagonists of the other movies. I think they're unlikely to be descendants of Skyview survivors themselves, because if death works down through the bloodlines, surely it would come for their parents first. But yes, this is the disturbing thing, and it kind of fits with the idea of death being like entropy, this kind of ever-expanding thing. You don't need to be a blood descendant of a Skyview survivor to be in trouble. Even interacting with a descendant of a Skyview survivor can put you at risk. And that's what happens to Eric. He's adopted, but when he messes with death, he faces a grisly end. And it is death's viciousness in these films, its use of cruel irony, which makes me think that it might be more than a force or entropy. I think it might be personal. However changeable death's design might be, there is a design, and if there's a design, there's probably a designer. But before we move on to the interpretations which see death as a conscious being, let's consider one last impersonal scientific interpretation. This one is wild. Theory number 4. Death is a multiverse maker. Each film begins with a massive disaster, and the protagonist, known as the Visionary, has a premonition of that disaster before it happens. Invariably, these protagonists act upon the premonition, saving themselves and some friends, thus changing the future, and death then comes for them through other means. And most interpretations of the franchise regard the premonitions as potential realities, i.e., if you don't get out of the way, this is what will happen to you. But here's where the multiverse comes in. What if the premonitions aren't potential realities, but alternate realities? And therefore each premonition is given at the moment of the universe forming a new branch, an alternate timeline. The Visionary, in their premonition, is seeing into the future of the primary timeline, in which they die in the disaster, but we then follow their new alternate self into a second timeline. It takes a different direction because they act upon their premonition. Now bear with me on this one, but if you ever come across the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, here's an excellent, concise explanation from Minute Physics.
You put a cat in a bunker with some unstable gunpowder that has a 50% chance of blowing up in the next minute, and a 50% chance of doing nothing. So until we look in the bunker, we don't know whether the cat is dead or alive. And when we do look, it is either dead or alive. So if we repeat the experiment enough times with enough cats and bunkers and gunpowder, we'll see that half the time, Kitty survives, and half the time, Kitty goes bye-bye. The quantum mechanical interpretation is that before we look, the cat is in a superposition. It's both dead and alive. And our act of looking forces nature's decision. So our curiosity kills the cat. But what about the cat's perspective? Well, the cat either sees the gunpowder explode or not. So inside the bunker, we actually have these two possibilities. The powder explodes and the cat sees it explode, or the powder doesn't explode and the cat doesn't see it explode. There's no option, the powder explodes and the cat doesn't see it explode. So the cat's reality becomes entangled with the outcome of the experiment, and it's our observation of the experiment that forces nature to collapse to one option or the other. But we're like the cat too. Either the cat dies and we see it dead, or the cat lives and we see it alive. So who's observing us to force nature to collapse to one reality? Or do both possibilities happen in parallel within a larger multiverse?
Whoa, pause it there. That looks suspiciously like the diagram I made earlier. This multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics is rejected by many, but of course in the fictional realm of Final Destination, it's entirely possible that the universe is forming a branching timeline with every premonition, and therefore the entity of death is a multiverse maker. This conversation between Alex and Clear in the first movie hints at such alternate realities.
When I was 10, my dad went into a 7-Eleven for cigarettes. I guess that he heard someone say, "Don't turn around," so on reflex, or thinking it was a friend joking, he did. And a guy blew his head off. It exists, that place, where my dad is still safe, where he had a full pack of cigarettes that night and just kept driving. Where me and my mom, my dad are still together and have no idea about this life here.
Maybe there is an alternate timeline, or multiple alternate timelines in which things worked out differently. Or maybe this is merely the sort of wishful thinking that you would expect in the wake of a tragedy. Now, the multiverse reading of the franchise is fun, and there might be scope to explore it further, but of the 5 theories I will present in this video, it is the one with the least amount of evidence. It might be what the filmmakers are going for, but if so, they haven't dropped any hints. Also, it raises all sorts of additional questions. If the protagonist dies in the primary timeline, why is death still coming for them in the alternate timeline? Perhaps it is the multiverse's way of preventing the branches from diverging too much. But this is all speculation. Just a quick note on the premonitions. After a premonition happens in a Final Destination film, the camera zooms out of their eye. And it's usually this eye. But sometimes it's this eye. Is there anything to that? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. So let's move on to our next theory, and remember we're counting down to my favourite. Number 3. Death is a stand-in for the filmmakers. Around the turn of the millennium, with postmodernism in full swing, horror movies became increasingly meta, especially films like Scream.
This isn't a movie.
Sure it is, Sid. It's all a movie. It's all one great big movie. You can't pick your genre.
And the Final Destination films are constantly riffing on cinema history. 1942 saw the release of a movie called Cat People, produced by Val Lewton, and it features this very memorable scene. A woman is walking alone at night, the tension builds and builds, and then what happens? A bus bursts into the frame. It's an early jump scare. Val Lewton used this technique in his later movies, and it became known as the Lewton bus. And you see it in tons of movies, including Final Destination. It's actually how Terry dies in the first movie. But in the run-up to her death, there is an apparently accidental reunion of the plane crash survivors. And who is the last person to arrive on the scene before Terry gets hit by the bus? The teacher, Valerie Lewton. Val Lewton. So Final Destination is using the classic cinema technique of the Lewton bus like a playing card, calling it out as it plays it. With the medium of cinema, you can achieve shocking effects like this. The director controls where the camera is pointing. We don't see beyond the frame. And that allows for things to enter the frame in unexpected ways, with zero warning. That's actually how death functions in the Final Destination movies. There is always the capacity for nasty surprises. Death isn't just trying to kill people, it's trying to kill people in shocking and cinematic ways. And this is why I think death in these movies might represent the filmmakers themselves in a kind of self-referential, ironic way, because they are the ones with the power to kill off even the main characters, and are willing to do it for the spectacle.
I think we were really successful in that people know that we're trying to fool them. So they're intelligent, they want to think ahead of you and sort of outwit the filmmakers. But I think in every single case, we managed to keep them fooled every step of the way, which, I thought was a real victory.
It's important to recognize just how much the first movie was shaped by feedback from its test screenings. And unashamedly so.
We have been test screening our movies since we started making them. If you have a movie that doesn't please people, spending $30 million to market it and get people in who aren't going to be pleased is not going to solve the problem by any way, shape, or form. So we find it a very valuable tool.
So they're trying to gauge more accurately what people like or dislike.
The original cut contained elements that didn't go down so well at the test screening, including Alex getting Clear pregnant.
In the original cut of the beach scene, they make love on the beach. We thought the only way you can really cheat death, or the only way you can really beat death, is to bring a new life into the world, because you can't really beat death.
But then, you got to the pregnancy bit, and you could just tell, oops, I lost him.
Alex, get away from there!
And then when Alex died, you just went, damn it, I lost him again.
This sort of spiritual ending, which had to do with Clear having a child and having the child be the vindication of how you beat death, was perhaps a little too esoteric and not visceral enough for the public that we were trying to attract, which was arguably a postmodern scream crowd.
So the possibility of birth invalidating death's list was, of course, raised instead in Final Destination 2.
There was a pregnant woman in a white delivery van.
If she gives birth to a baby that would have died in that car crash,
Wow.
a brand new soul that was never part of Death's design.
It throws the whole list out of whack and we start over with a clean slate.
But it wasn't confirmed whether or not it actually works. And then Final Destination Bloodlines finally reveals the answer. It doesn't work, because a lot of those Skyview survivors go on to have children, but that does nothing to stop the onslaught of death. Back to that first movie.
That was another thing in the first test. People really didn't like Carter. They didn't like that Carter lived.
Alex was right. It did skip us. There was a design, and we won.
Now that we've won, Carter, there's a chance at a full life. A chance that I am not going to waste. Because for all of us, there is that one day.
The loftier goals of the ending kind of fell on deaf ears a little bit.
One day.
We went for something a little more, sentimental, a little deeper, and they just wanted to see more death.
The team at New Line Cinema made tweaks, optimizing the film to a postmodern audience, creating the ending that we all know.
Let's give the audience what they want. They want Alex to live, they want the bad guy to die.
I told you were next, and it just skipped me. So who's next?
the audience just started applauding and going nuts.
People actually jumped out of their seats and cheered.
The scores improved like 50%. I mean, it was like astounding.
And that set the blueprint for every Final Destination movie to come. The futile battle with death in these films, at least initially, wasn't shaped by a rich, carefully drawn mythology. It was driven by the maximization of screams and gasps in the test screenings, like a roller coaster. The dials were adjusted until maximum shock value was achieved. Admittedly, this is the case for lots of horror movies, but Final Destination is rather unique because its villain, its monster, is so mysterious and undefined, and that makes it very malleable, like putty in the hands of the studio. It allows them to concoct the most grisly deaths imaginable.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Reddick, and I'm one of the writers of Final Destination. You know, we just kept changing the story. At first we had a slasher killer, and then we decided we didn't want to have that. We wanted to have death itself. And we personified it the first time, but then we decided that that was a little hokey too, so we went back and really made death more of a presence, somebody who kind of influenced life and got people to die, as opposed to somebody who just comes out and grabs them and kills them.
And it's the deaths that ended up taking priority in the wake of the test screenings. So who is the killer in these movies? The film studio? New Line Cinema? Yes. But ultimately, it is the audience that is baying for blood. It is the audience that pushed for more deaths and more brutality in those deaths. So that's a meta-interpretation of Final Destination. Death in these movies represents an industry driven by the spectacle of gruesome demise. Now, I'm a horror fan, but maybe this should make us at least a little uncomfortable. Is it possible to enjoy horror movies for bad reasons? Absolutely. And have we pushed the industry for more and more and more? But here's the thing, if this meta-interpretation of death in the Final Destination universe, if it is valid, it's not necessarily exhaustive, because lots of postmodern horror films have a meta element alongside something more. So let's move on to our next interpretation. At 2, death is a demon. Occasionally in the films we get a glimpse of death's presence. Sometimes it's a strange, blurry shadow. Sometimes the branches of a tree seem to align like a skeleton. But really we never see death adopt a physical, tangible form. What we see are his effects, influencing the physical world to bring about the brutal demise of the human characters. And these lethal Rube Goldberg-style chain reactions almost always begin with a small breeze, wind, an impulse to get things moving. In the Hebrew Bible, the word for wind and breath is the same as the word for spirit, ruach. And in my video about the first 5 movies, I suggested that it might be possible to see the character of death as a single evil spirit acting locally, a particular agent of death among many others, rather than a personification of all death. The Final Destination comic Spring Break depicts death as a demonic figure surrounded by smoke. Notice the horns. The 5th Final Destination novel, Looks Could Kill, depicts death as a tall African-American man dressed in a grey suit, carrying a cane tipped with a miniature skull. But this seems to be a form he adopts in order to converse with humans. There was speculation for a while that William Bloodworth was a manifestation of death in the films.
I'll see you soon.
But Bloodlines confirms that isn't the case. No, he's a survivor from the Skyview. He knows a lot about death, but death is actually coming for him too. So maybe the figure of death in these films is some kind of demon, in which case efforts to cheat its design are unlikely to be helpful. What we need is an exorcism. However, the slightly tactless references to Abraham Lincoln and 9/11 in Final Destination 3 do seem to frame him as a personification of all death, personally responsible for each and every demise in human history.
That's the last photograph Lincoln posed for. The photographic plate was broken, causing a line that can't be removed. Exactly where he was shot. Look, see the shadow?
And the first novel, Dead Reckoning, seems to describe death's true form, if it is his true form, as this monstrous creature. In appearance, it's a bit like a giant skeleton, but really it's a shifting amalgamation of the decaying bodies of every species. This is proper cosmic horror stuff, and it leads me to believe that perhaps death in this franchise is seen as something more powerful than a demon. Which brings me to my top theory. Death is the god of the Final Destination universe. From everything we've seen, including the fresh insights of Final Destination Bloodlines, the figure of death in this franchise appears to be sovereign over everything. The fourth film even seems to suggest that he is the source of the premonitions.
What if we didn't change anything?
What are you talking about?
What if us being here, right now, was the plan from the beginning?
The disturbing implication is that these characters never had an ounce of free will. They felt like they did, but really, their lives were running on train tracks. They thought they had received the premonitions to help them avoid death, but really they were part of death's means of getting them to this exact moment at this exact time. It couldn't have gone any other way. So why would death be so convoluted in getting to people? Perhaps he's playing with them. To me, this does seem the most likely interpretation of what the filmmakers are going for with this franchise. They really have tried to position death as the ultimate power, the god of the Final Destination universe. But here's the thing. Life has to come before death. So we're being asked to believe that death is not only the killer in the Final Destination universe, he is also, surely, the creator of the Final Destination universe. So what sort of deity is this? Let's run the thought experiment. Death is what he's all about. That's his thing. But in order to cause death, he needed something to kill. So he created an incredibly intricate world and populated it with incredibly intricate people endowed with a sense of right and wrong. And now he's spending his time picking them off one by one. But he can't kill them too fast, because if he kills everyone, then he won't be able to kill anymore. So he has to kill at a rate that is equal to or lower than the birth rate. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? And here's why. Evil and death aren't original. They can't come first. They can't be primary, because evil is a perversion, a twisting of good. Good has to come first. And death is a perversion of life. Life has to come first. If we try to imagine a universe ruled by an evil god, we're forced to appeal to something even greater, because we cannot call him evil unless there is good. As C.S. Lewis said, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. So the Final Destination god is a useful thought experiment. We can only call him evil because we believe in a standard that's even greater than him, an ultimate good. And therefore evil and death cannot be the ultimate power. There's something even greater and older. The god of the Final Destination universe could never be the true god. And that's encouraging. But as I've said, it makes for an interesting thought experiment, and it reflects the postmodern angst from which the films arose. So there we go. 5 different interpretations of death in the Final Destination universe. We might never get a definitive answer, and I kind of like the mystery. Let me know which of those theories you like the most. Let me know if there are any theories that should have made my top 5. And I have something exciting to share. I'm working on a short, fan-made Final Destination movie. It's called Final Destination Twins, and it's about 2 identical twins battling against death. And the fact that they're genetically identical has some new implications for death's design. Intrigued? I would love to welcome you aboard. If you join my Patreon for just $1 a month, you will get early access to the scripts, you can share your thoughts, you will get early access to the finished film, and if you're happy with it, your name will appear in the credits. The link is in the description below. I am so grateful to all of you for your support, and I'm looking forward to sharing this fan-made movie with you. My name's Thomas Thorogood. I get into the deeper meaning of movies. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, it's deeper than you think.